Privilege and a pleasure to be here. My husband and I have looked forward to coming, and now we're here, we are enjoying ourselves. It really is lovely to be here. We're going to spend most of our time this morning in Mark chapter 5, and there we find three stories. But the good news is we're only going to look at two of them. So you will get home and you will have dinner. But if you were to look at Mark chapter 5, you could say it's the home for incurables, the hopeless cases in the Gospel of Mark. You have a demoniac man, you have a diseased woman, and you have a dead girl. Now, if they were alive today, the demoniac man, where would we put him? Psychiatric unit. Yes, you're right. The woman with the chronic illness, where would we put her? A hospice. And the dead girl, where would we put her? In the morgue. Yeah. And yet, as we look at the stories in Mark 5, we discover that there aren't any hopeless cases for Jesus. Because for Jesus, to the demoniac man, he becomes the great psychiatrist. For the diseased woman, he becomes the physician. And for the dead girl, he becomes the great pediatrician. And so there are some interesting things to note. We're going to take the story of the dead girl and the diseased woman. So we're going to take Jairus' daughter and the woman, and we don't know her name. Now, there are some interesting parallels to note between these two characters. We don't actually know either of their names. The little girl, we just know that we know her dad's name, but we don't know her name. And the woman, she's just the diseased woman. We have the powerless and the powerful. So you have Jairus, who is very powerful, and he comes to Jesus on behalf of his little daughter, and you have the woman and the daughter who are powerless. They can't do anything for themselves. And then Jesus meets the needs of everyone, but he particularly pays attention to the powerless. And then the little girl is 12 years old, and she is just on the verge of everything that life has to offer. And the woman has been sick for 12 years. So just keep those things in mind as we read the story together. But let's look first at the story of the woman. It sort of comes in parentheses. Jesus is on his way to heal Jairus' daughter. And you know, Jairus is described as one of the rulers of the synagogue. Now, if you're a ruler of the synagogue, this wasn't a position that you chose yourself. It was, they had a nominating committee, and they nominated Jairus to be the ruler of the synagogue. So he would have been like Ken, he'd have led the worship, he'd have taught the people. So he was a well-respected man in the community. Now, we know that he probably had come in contact with Jesus before, because we had the centurion who also lived in the same village, and his servant was sick. He was a Roman, his servant was sick. And so he came and he asked the leaders of the synagogue, now Jairus was a leader in the synagogue, to come and, you know, to intercede on his behalf. So Jairus and Jesus have met. But now Jairus has a balancing act, because he knows that the scribes and the Pharisees, they're not that keen on Jesus. And he wants to keep them happy. he probably likes his position in the town. But, you know, now it's one thing to come and intercede for somebody else, but now he has a problem. His daughter's sick. Jesus has healed the demoniac man. He's come across the lake, the Sea of Galilee, and obviously people have heard that he's coming. And so when he comes, Jairus is there, and he asks for a favour. He does the only thing he can do. He comes to Jesus and he says, Jesus, I need your help. My daughter is dying. Please come with me. Heal her. And Jesus says yes. Now they all go. Now it's not just Jesus and Jairus and his disciples. It says there's a huge crowd of people. Now large crowds don't move quickly. And I can imagine Jairus along beside Jesus trying to jostle him along, you know, trying to just keep this thing moving because he wants for his little girl to be better. That is the only thing he's interested in. And on the way, there is a woman. And we read about her in the scripture reading. Verse 25 of Mark 5. She'd been the subject for bleeding for 12 years. Now, we don't know what caused this problem, but we do know that if you've been bleeding, if you have internal hemorrhaging for 12 years, you are chronically ill. There's no discussion about that. And this woman is chronically ill. And verse 26 unpacks it a little bit more. Now, if there are medical people here, I apologise. But it says here, she suffered a lot at the hands of doctors. So, you know, she has tried everything. She suffered physically through the loss of blood. Now, if you lose blood, she would have been weak. She would have been anemic. So she wouldn't have had a lot of physical strength. She has tried the remedies of the doctors. Now, I don't know what you know about remedies in Bible times, but I did some research, and just for you a little bit of education. This was one of the rabbis that lived around this time, and this is what he said: if someone had bleeding that was going on and you know, just not stopping. So this is the kind of treatment she would have had. Take the gum of Alexandria, of alum and of crocus, and weigh a zuzi of each, small amount. Let them be bruised together and given in a wine to a woman that has an issue of blood. If this doesn't work, take Persian onions, 9 logs, boil them in wine, and give it to her to drink and say, arise from your flux. If this doesn't work, set her in a place where 2 ways meet, and let her hold a cup of wine in her hand, and let someone come from behind and frighten her, and say, arise from your flux. But if this doesn't work, take a handful of cumin, a handful of crocus, a handful of fenugreek, let these be boiled and give to her to drink, and say, arise from your flux. But if this also should fail, so this is the last resort. Dig 7 trenches and burn in them cuttings of vines, not yet circumcised, which was vines that were 4 years old, not 4 years old. Let her take a cup of wine in her hand, and let her be led from this trench and sat down over that, and let her be removed from that and set down over another, and in each removal say unto her, arise from your flux. Now, I don't know how that sounds to you, but that sounds to me pretty horrendous. And this is the kind of thing that this poor woman would have suffered. Now, she would have suffered, apart from the physical suffering, she would have suffered socially. because she couldn't be married, because she was bleeding, any kind of physical contact would have made the person touching her unclean. So, if she had been married, her husband would have divorced her long ago. She'd had no one to give her hugs, no one to even just stroke her face or say something nice. And we all need some kind of physical touch. It's a proven point. We need a physical touch. And so she would be an outcast from society. She couldn't live with other people. She spent all her money, and so her life would have been reduced to begging for scraps of food. She suffered emotionally. For 12 years, she has not had social contact. She's just been rejected, in greater and greater isolation. And she suffered religiously. She couldn't come to church. She couldn't go to the temple because she was unclean. So she couldn't go and get any kind of spiritual food. She couldn't come and worship with other people. And she has suffered financially. So she is in a situation of no hope. And she knows that she is under a death sentence. And then in verse 27 it says, when she heard about Jesus. Now, I don't know how she heard about Jesus. Maybe it was a leper. Maybe it was somebody else who was an outcast. Maybe when she came to beg for food, somebody at a distance told her about Jesus. I don't know. But we do know, if we earlier in Mark, we know that in the earlier chapter there was the man who was possessed by demons. In Luke 6 and 19 it says, where Jesus went, even those who were, his shadow covered, they were healed. So, we don't know where she heard, but somewhere she heard about Jesus. And when she heard about Jesus, she thought, if only I could touch his cloak, I will be healed. Now, think about this. Here is a woman who doesn't have a lot of physical strength. And she has now decided to get all her physical strength to go and to touch Jesus. But now think, she's not allowed to go where there are people. So if anyone recognizes her when she is going through that crowd of people, because everyone she touches will be unclean, a mob, a crowd can easily become a mob. She risks being stoned. And yet, she decides to take all her courage and go. And so when she is, in verse 29, when she is near enough, she reaches out and she touches him. And immediately, she's healed. Now the word for touch here means to cling, to hold on, to keep holding on until you get what you want. So she held on until she knew, I'm healed, I'm whole. And then we come to verse 30 to 33. At once, Jesus realizes that power had gone out from him, and he turns around to the crowd and he says, who touched me? Now, immediately the disciples say, oh, come on, look at all the people. Everyone's here jostling. Look at Jairus, everyone's trying to move you along. But there was something different. Here was a touch of faith. And then, Jesus speaks to the woman. And she comes, and this time she's not behind Jesus, she's in front of him. Now this was the woman who didn't want to come openly to Jesus. And now suddenly, publicly, she's telling her whole story. She's acknowledging, this is who I am, this is what was wrong with me, and yes, I touched you, and now I am whole. You know, when she came to Jesus, she was afraid of rejection. That's why she touched him and didn't come and ask. Now she is whole. She's not afraid of rejection. She comes and she falls at her feet and she tells him. She isn't ashamed anymore. And then Jesus looks at her and he says, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Now, Jesus is just confirming what she knows has happened. And he's not doing it for her benefit. He's doing it for everyone else. But he is doing one thing for her benefit. Think of this woman has been emotionally, physically isolated. And suddenly, Jesus calls her my daughter. He's saying to her, you may not have had a family for the last 12 years, but now you're part of my family. You're my daughter. You belong to me. You have a big family. You're my daughter. And I love you. And you belong to me no matter what else happens. And then he tells her to go in peace. He wants her to know that she's done the right thing in coming to him and in touching him. Any other man in that crowd that day would have been offended. Any other man would have sent her away with a kick or with abuse. But when this woman came with a grain of faith and touched him, Jesus accepted her and said, she is my daughter. But now, back to the story. Just imagine Jairus while all of this is happening. I think he was probably hopping from one foot to the other. He didn't care about this woman. All he cared about was his daughter. And his daughter's at home and she's ill. And so now, you know, we're coming along and as they go along, the message comes, your daughter is dead. Now there's no nice way of wrapping up that news. And the person was quite blunt and just said, don't bother Jesus anymore, nothing he can do, your daughter's dead, end of story, we might as well all go home. But remember, when Jairus came to Jesus, Jesus went with him. And now Jairus had exercised faith. And now Jesus says to him, don't be afraid, just believe. Now Jesus doesn't ask Jairus to believe without any evidence. He's just given him evidence. There was the evidence of the centurion's servant, but now he has just healed this woman in front of Jairus. So there is evidence there. And Jesus is saying to Jairus, believe. Don't be afraid, just believe. And Jairus, faith and fear pull him in opposite directions. Does he believe? Should he be fearful? What's going to happen? We come to the house. Now we all express grief and our feelings in different ways. Some of us are very quiet, some are noisy, and in this context there would be professional mourners who would make an awful noise. And Jesus takes James, Peter, John, and says to these women, why are you crying? Why are you making this noise? She's only asleep. And then we see the true nature of their sorrow. They just laugh. And they say, no, you've got it all wrong. And Jesus says, no. And he goes with Peter, James and John and the parents into the room, goes over to the little girl. She's probably still warm. And he takes her hand and he says, little girl, I say to you, get up. And having done the miracle, Jesus says two things. 1, give her something to eat, and 2, don't tell anyone. Now, why do you think Jesus said, don't tell anyone? Okay, you can speak. Why? Well, I like to use my imagination when I read the Bible, and I like to try and think, why would Jesus do something like this? And I think it was, here's a little 12-year-old girl. She's just on the verge of becoming a woman in that culture, and he doesn't want everyone pointing down the street and saying, she was the one who was dead, and Jesus, and oh, why should she be subjected to sensation-seeking crowds? She didn't need it, and the Lord didn't want to advance his popularity at the expense of a little girl. And then, there's a practical thing. Give her something to eat. Now, any of us who've been sick knows that there comes a point when suddenly we feel better, and then we are starving. We want something to eat. Here's a little girl, she's been sick for days, she hasn't eaten. And Jesus thinks of her practical needs and says, give her something to eat. So what can we learn? How can we apply this to our lives? Jesus cares for our problems. He cares for individuals. A father and mother cared for their daughter, and Jesus was right there with them, caring for her and for their problems. Jesus performs a miracle, and he raises a little girl from the dead, but he's also concerned about giving her breakfast. And that tells us something about the heart of God when he looks at each one of us. He doesn't just care about the big problems. He cares about the little things as well. There is no detail that is too small. Whether we are powerful, whether we are somebody who's got lots of strength and vigour, whether we have an important job, or whether we feel that we are nothing, we're the powerless little mouse, whether we feel weak, whether we feel helpless. It doesn't matter where we are, God can meet our needs. And in that day, in that crowd that day, there were dozens, maybe hundreds of people that touched Jesus. And of all those people, they had needs. And yet, there was just one woman who received healing. And she received healing because she came to Jesus in faith. She reached out and she touched him. She saw him as her only source. She believed that he could help her, and when she touched him, she was made whole. And Jesus is the same today. It doesn't matter what is troubling us. It doesn't matter whether it's physical, whether it's mental, whether it's emotional. When we reach out to him, he is willing to make each one of us whole. Just as he cared for this woman, nothing is too big or too small to gain his attention. All we have to do is reach out, hold fast, and he will make us whole.